welcome everyone to today. We come together to explore the lives and legacy and enduring relevance of two instrumental figures in the struggle for racial and economic justice, George Jackson and Assata Shakur. George Jackson's writings and activisms reveal deep roots of systematic oppression and the transformative power of revolutionary thought. From his incarceration to his assassination, Jackson remains a symbol of resistance against racial and economic inequalities. Similarly, Assata Shakur, poet, revolutionary, and a symbol of Black liberation, continues to inspire as a powerful testament to the fight for racial justice and against the criminalization of dissent. In this discussion, we will examine three ideologies: the systemic forces they challenge and the ongoing resonance of their work in today's fight for equality and justice. Robert Saleem Holbrook bio, I am about to read his bio, and I am honored to do so. Robert is an executive director of both the Abolitionist Law Center, a 501c3 public interest law firm, and a community organization project, and its sister organization, Straight Ahead, a 501c4 legislative and electoral advocacy group. Saleem is a former juvenile lifer who served 27 years in Pennsylvania's state prison, including a total of 10 years in solitary confinement after being sentenced to life without parole for an offense he was involved with as a 16-year-old child. He was released in 2018 after the Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles are unconstitutional. While incarcerated, Saleem studied liberation movements and was mentored by older political and politicized prisoners. He began to write extensively on prison abuse, social injustice, state violence, and juveniles charged and sentenced as adults, and saw his work published in Truth Out, The Appeal, San Francisco Bay View, and Solitary Watch. I first became aware of Mr. Holbrook's through his work with Address This, a program that provides innovative correspondence courses to people incarcerated in Pennsylvania, with a special focus on participation of prisoners in solitary confinement or maximum security, who often have little access to or educational options. Saleem will be in conversation today with Eastern State's Director of Education, Lauren Zalit.
Thank you, Erica. Let's give it up for Erica. And I'm honored to be here with you, Saleem, to have this conversation. Thank you, everybody joining us in person, everybody joining us online. We'll chat for about 20 minutes. I have a timer going here, so we stay on time today. And then we'll have time for a few questions. If you have questions today online, you can submit those via the Q&A function in the Zoom. And I'll receive a text from Jackie and our marketing team to let me know what they are. If you're here in the audience and you want to ask a question, Angela has index cards. Just raise your hand. She'll come around. You can write it down. She'll hand them to me, and I'll ask them to Saleem. So Saleem, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's an honor. We just want to start with, who was George Jackson? How did his time in prison shape his political views, his leadership, and his revolutionary ideas?
Thank you. I mean, I feel like you could do a whole seminar on George Jackson, so I'm really going to try and sum it up. First, George Jackson is kind of like the patron saint of radical prisoners. And actually, not just in the United States, but around the world. George Jackson is someone that went to prison as a juvenile. He had a very extensive juvenile record as a child. When he was 18 years old, he participated in a robbery of a gas station for a paltry sum of money. And when he was sentenced, the judge gave him what was called an indeterminate sentence back then. And these sentences were like a considered like a radical reform back then, whereas though they would give you this sentence like 1 year to 10 year, 1 year to 20 year. In George Jackson's case, they gave him 1 year to life in prison, right? And so George Jackson entered the state prison system, a young 18-year-old, with an indeterminate 1 year to life sentence. The ideal was that after 1 year, he would have rehabilitated himself, reformed himself, went through the programs, and been granted parole. The reality was completely different. You put an 18-year-old black youth in the California prison system back then, which was a very brutal and racist prison system. Naturally, George Jackson was caught up in the culture and an environment of prison. One, he had to survive. Two, California prisons then as now was really involved in racial conflicts. A lot of those conflicts were initiated by guards. It would be an understatement or even a disservice to George Jackson to say that prison formed George Jackson. Mm-hmm. George Jackson was really inspired in prison by the liberation movements, the anti-colonial movements going on in Africa and around the world. George Jackson identified himself as a communist because of his upbringing. His family came up from the South, moved to Chicago, and lived in the projects. They were poor, looking for work. George went to California with his family in California, but his family was part of that history of migration for black communities in the United States. First, they migrated, they fled the racial terror of the South, came up north into Chicago, were trapped in poverty, right? And had to escape the poverty and the circumstances of just violence as a kid growing up in the projects and sought refuge in California. Unfortunately, he couldn't escape the discrimination and poverty. So when he went to prison, he thought of all of the things that led his family from these different migrations and flights and recognized that it was capitalism, recognizing that it was racial discrimination in the United States. And so he really became involved in, as he defined it, an internationalist. He wanted to change the racist, corrupt, classist, and unjust system of the United States. However, that brought him into conflict with the guards now, right? Because you can imagine in the 1960s identifying yourself as a communist. I mean, hell, you call yourself a communist now, you're still gonna catch flack, right? You can imagine back then, it was completely different. So George, because of his politics, he set off on an inevitable clash with the prison state. However, I would say that the defining moment for George Jackson occurred in August of 1969 when they had black prisoners segregated in solitary confinement from white prisoners, white racist prisoners who were armed by the guards. And on this particular day, they had been not allowed in the yard for months, but they finally opened the yard up because there were so many brawls going on in the yard. And there were 4 black prisoners and 4 white prisoners that got into a fist fight in the yard. And a prison guard named Opie Miller opened fire on the yard. And at the end of that, 3 black prisoners were killed. W.L. Nolan, who was George Jackson's mentor, Alvin Miller, and Cleveland Edwards. That incident right there set off a chain reaction in California's prisons that over the course, I would say 3 years, resulted in 25 people being killed, 7 correctional officers. George Jackson was friends with all of those prisoners. They all were part of the same political formation in the inside. The guard that killed them, Opie Miller, was a known racist, white supremacist guard. The fact that none of the white prisoners were shot was clear evidence that this was a racially motivated fight. There were no weapons involved. It literally was a fist fight. Prisoners got together, and this is where where George Jackson is really a controversial figure, and sometimes could be difficult for people to embrace. Black prisoners got together and said, okay, we're gonna give the system a chance. A grand jury was convened to investigate the killings. The ruling came back that the killings were justified. Within 1 hour of that ruling, a prison guard was killed on a cell block. George Jackson was arrested for it and 2 other prisoners. As a result of that, George Jackson released his autobiography, Soledad Brother. This was geared up because the state was trying to kill him. for retaliating against the murder of his three friends. That book right there, Soledad Brother, became an international bestseller. And what was really unique about Soledad Brother was that George Jackson talked about all of the problems he had coming up as a juvenile, as a child, but he also connected it with the larger injustice of the United States. And a lot of people compare that book to Malcolm X's autobiography, right? So George Jackson eventually, and I mean, like I said, it's so much to George Jackson, I'm really trying to give a thumbnail approach. He became a member of the Black Panther Party in prison. He was appointed Field Marshal of the Black Panther Party. He had a lot of contacts with people all throughout the world. He was eventually assassinated. His younger brother also was assassinated. And you have to understand the times. George Jackson and the formation that he came out of, and this is where prison influences you. Prison is a violent environment. And George Jackson came up that he believed in self-defense, but he also believed that a good defense is an offense. So they basically were saying, you murdered my friends in cold blood. We are not going to allow ourselves to be killed, so we are going to fight back. And so his younger brother, Jonathan Jackson, often gets overshadowed by George Jackson, but Jonathan Jackson was 17 years old when he went into a courtroom and took hostages, the judge hostage, to free his brother. The San Quentin prison guards came and opened fire on the van that they were in. The judge was killed, Jonathan Jackson was killed, 2 other people were killed. That right there, as if George Jackson didn't need a reason to even understand that this system was unjust and was going to kill him. That moment right there put George on an inevitable course where he attempted to escape in August 21st, 1971. In the course of George Jackson's escape, 3 guards were killed, and George Jackson was killed, as well as 2 racist white prisoners who were members of the Aryan Brotherhood. A lot of people would like to make George Jackson out as a victim. George Jackson was not a victim. A lot of people would like to make George Jackson out. Was he innocent? No, he was not. George Jackson was clear. He retaliated. And he was also clear that in America, and I remember his saying, he had a saying that if there were going to be funerals, there were going to be funerals on both sides. And he said that because he was tired of seeing so many martyrs from the civil rights movement be killed. And he listed them all. Martin Luther King, the Burlington Four, when the 4 black girls were killed in the church in Burlington, Alabama. The Philadelphia Three, Joseph Chaney. He listed all of them, and he said, I'm tired of there being funerals only on our side. So from this day forth, he said that there's going to be funerals on both sides. And so that's a controversial statement, but I think that it's a necessary statement, specifically for those times. Because when we talk about the civil rights movement, a lot of times we are only taught about Martin Luther King, Ella Baker, Julian Bond. But there was also another side of our movement, of the Black liberation movement, who were seeking more than just civil rights, who were seeking human rights, who were seeking dignity, but also were driven into a collision course with the state and were not going to allow themselves or members of their communities to be harmed, and were willing actually to, in Malcolm's word, resist by any means necessary. And so when you talk about that today, it makes some people uncomfortable, right? But when you look around the world, the Irish did it, right? I mean, we celebrate President Bill Clinton hosted members of the Irish Republican Army in the White House, right? And they were clear that Irish liberation was going to come through dynamite, the ballot box, or the Arlamite, which was an AR-17. And they said that, and they were embraced. So this tendency for us to embrace liberation movements or movements that raise up around the world, but not domestic ones, is something that has a long strand in the United States politics. But also, if you look at the people that are rising up, it's often black and brown people that makes people uncomfortable when these historically oppressed sections of our country rise up with that position. So that's who George Jackson was in a nutshell. I would definitely encourage you to read more about him. He was an eloquent writer, and he was brilliant.
And speaker.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah,
And he
yeah.
spoke from prison, I believe, correct?
There's clips on the internet that you can get, but I think that George Jackson's eloquence is really in his writings.
Yeah. So we have our homework, right? We all need to get Soledad Brother. We all need to dig into this text, and I'm ready to sign up for any class that you teach on this topic, Saleem. And so we also want to connect ourselves here today to another figure, Assata Shakur. What inspired her work? What inspired her beliefs and her activism?
I tell you, picking these two, I don't know. You are really trying to get in trouble. I'm serious.
We're trying to have a nuanced conversation with you today.
And it's definitely a nuanced conversation. You know, we know about Angela Davis. We love Angela Davis. Angela Davis hosted by the White House. We love Ella Baker. I mean, there's so many. Fannie Lou Hamer, Assata Shakur. You're going to get in trouble there. You know, Assata Shakur, like George Jackson, was someone whose family came up from the South. I believe it was South Carolina, to New York. Assata, unlike George, actually lived a very middle-class black life. In her own words, she became radicalized when she went to college. She went to Manhattan Junior College. It was the era of the civil rights movement, but even though she was the South, her family was from the South, she kind of was cocooned from it. If you read her autobiography, she saw glimpses of it, but it was not something that was really on her family's radar or on her radar. But when she went into college, it was really a hotbed of radicalism, not just within the civil rights movement, but it was also members of the Black Panther Party. Pan-Africanism was really heavy. She, in her own words, became just aware, of this injustice in the country, but also not just in the South. She became blown away by the poverty of Harlem, the poverty of New York when she started moving around. And again, she found that at every social indicator in the United States, black people were at the bottom, whether it was poverty, wages, healthcare, whatever you call it. And so she was like, I'm tired of this, I'm gonna do something about it. She started out feeding people, right? But again, she also could not be divorced from what was going on in the South. But when she joined the Black Panther Party, again, the Black Panther Party was a radical organization. They were seeking, actually, they were a radical organization, but some of the things that they were doing that was identified by the FBI as the most dangerous was not arming themselves, right? The Black Panthers are famously known for carrying guns. That's your right. That's your Second Amendment right to carry guns in this country. It's funny because when they went up to the state capitol in 1968 in California, they carried their guns up there. And all of the most conservative pro-gun advocates literally within a week passed a law saying you can't carry open arms no more. They was like, no, black people coming up here with guns, it wasn't meant for that, right? But the most radical things that they did, according to the FBI, was they fed people. They had a free food program. They had a free healthcare clinic in communities to help black, brown, white. If you were poor, you could go to their clinics. You could get health care. If your children were hungry going to school, they could get food. They had medical care. They also had senior patrols. And what I mean by that is seniors who couldn't have food or didn't have family members to take care of them, they would take care of them. They had community patrols. What they did was they said, where is the need in our community? We'll identify. So Assata became a part of that. But in response to that, she was watching her comrades get killed by the FBI. Fred Hampton, she was watching 21 Black Panthers get arrested because they were accused of trying to blow up the Statue of Liberty, which was not true. They were all acquitted. And the FBI were following her around. She decided to go undercover, and I'm trying to give y'all the real quick version of this. The Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army was formed in the 70s, and they made a decision after police were continuing to kill members of the Black Panther Party that they were going to retaliate. It was a political decision. It wasn't just a bunch of angry black people sitting around the table like, to hell with it, we're gonna run out in the streets and kill some police. No, they made a very conscious decision after close to 28 members of the Black Panther Party were killed across the country in police raids that we are going to systematically retaliate against police. One for one was what basically their motto. Assata was accused of being a part of that, although she was never convicted of any of that. She went on the run, and in 1970, I believe, on the New Jersey Jersey Turnpike. She was in a car. She was heading down south, and there was a shootout. A state trooper was killed. A member of the Black Liberation Army that was in the car was killed. Assata Shakur, her elbow was practically shot off. She was captured along with Assata Shakur. She was sentenced to spend life in prison, and about 5 years later, the Black Liberation Army went into the prison, got her out, and she found exile in Cuba, where she still is today. She's on the terrorist watch list. Of all the ironic things in this world, Obama was the one that put her on the terrorist watch list. So that's who Assata Shakur is. Again, I would encourage people to read her autobiography and read up about her, because although they tried to make her out as this really radical figure, they were never able to back it up with evidence. And in Assata's own words, and even in some of the people who prosecuted the members of the Black Liberation own words, what made Assata Shakur so dangerous was that she became a symbol. She became a symbol of self-determination. And the works that they were doing that was considered so dangerous was their community work.
Thank you for that. And I am getting a message that our Zoom mics may not be picking up, if we just want to look into that. And believe it or not, Saleem, this is my last question for you. So I want to encourage anybody on the Zoom, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. If you're here in the room with us, raise your hand and Angela will bring you an index card and we can turn it over to some audience questions. So my last question for you is, how did you first become aware of George Jackson and Assata Shakur, and how has their writing influenced you in the work that you do, or in general in your life?
I first became aware of George Jackson when I was 18 years old in solitary confinement. I read his book, Soul of Dead Brother. And George Jackson, like I said, in the prison system, particularly if you're someone who has become politicized in prison, I mean, we don't even call him George Jackson in prison. We just call him George. Like, it's almost on a first place name basis. Like, hey, if you read George, a lot of prisoners who are politicized. And the same thing with Assata Shakur. I became aware of her probably in my early 20s when I read the autobiography of Assata Shakur. And then how they influenced me, like I said, as we're talking about, these are two controversial figures within American radicalism, the American Civil Rights Movement and the Black Liberation Movement. But I think that more than anything that influenced me was how they identified the inequalities and the injustices in this system, systematically pointed them out and said, okay, we need to do something about them. We need to change these systems. We need to right the imbalance, right? Because a lot of people get caught up on Assata Shakur, the fugitive Assata Shakur, the member of the Black Liberation Army, or George Jackson, the radical revolutionary. But certainly those are things to look up to, but it was more importantly the eloquency of both of them in expressing the conditions that exist in this country that create a George Jackson, right? That create an Assata Shakur. So for me, if people want to criticize George Jackson for what he did, or Assata Shakur for who she is, you need to also criticize the conditions that created them, because in their own words, that was the crucible. And for me, that was my crucible, solitary confinement in prison, that made me who I am today.
Thank you, Saleem. And I think that saying that, like, in their own words, right, we should go back to their text, we should go back to their words, we should try to understand them through those books. And I'm just waiting on any questions from the Zoom. Jackie and Angela, we have a couple cards, if you could bring them up to me. It's kind of hard to come down from the stool here. Thank you so much, Damon. When you think about the legacy of Assata Shakur and George Jackson, what message would you offer to high school students here in Philadelphia?
Wow. High school students are a tough nut to crack, man, when you're talking about that. I think that George Jackson and Assata Shakur are people that, I'll tell you, I wish I learned about them in school when I was coming up, instead of learning about them in solitary confinement, after being a menace, well, not a menace, but after harming my own community, to see people that were actually trying to improve our communities. So I would definitely love that if they had an opportunity to read some of George Jackson's work, particularly about his challenges growing up as a child, the evolution of his thinking, because you know George Jackson, like me, started out as like a young, not necessarily a gangbanger, but a delinquent, getting involved in fights and doing all type of crazy things. But then he also matured into an eloquent writer and a brilliant political theorist. And the same thing with Assata Shakur, man. You know, I think I really wish people could see who Assata Shakur was. I mean, Assata Shakur, was a general in our liberation movement. She was a modern day Harriet Tubman. And I always tell people, you know, coming up, I remember reading about Martin Luther King in school, and I used to think that he was alive 100 or 50 years ago, and this was like the early 80s, because it seemed so distant the way it was taught. It would be great if, in addition to our children learning about Harriet Tubman, they can learn about modern Harriet Tubmans like Assata Shakur. I think that education of them too is necessary for Black children in this country, and I think it's part of the American. It should be part of the American curriculum. And if it's not in our schools, then we damn sure need to create those curriculums in our household.
Hear, hear. I just really want to thank you so much. I want to thank everybody who's here, and I'm going to invite Erica back up to close us out. Thank you, Erica.
As we close today's discussion, we are left with powerful reminders from both Assata Shakur and George Jackson. Assata's life challenges us to confront the deep questions of justice, resistance, and the ongoing fight for Black liberation. Her story urges us to reflect, also to act. As she once said, the struggle is for the strong, the brave, the visionary. Similarly, George Jackson's words echo urgency. The only way to live on this planet with any human dignity at this present time is to struggle. His life reminds us that resistance is not a choice, but a necessity. Let their legacy continue to inspire and propel us towards action, justice, and relentless pursuit of equality. Thank you all for joining our discussion today. Thank you, Robert and Liz, for your great conversation. Please welcome